Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Eileen Troberman, an Alexander Technique teacher in Encinitas, California, not too far from San Diego. And Eileen and I were both long-term students of the late Marjorie Barstow, and this is our second interview about her teaching. We're going to um, talk a little more than we did in the first interview about Marge's training us students to be able to observe ourselves and others. We're going to talk about something else. I forget what the second thing is. Do you remember, Eileen? Maybe you don't.
Uh,
Anyway, we're going to talk about something else, and then we're going to veer into some somewhat controversial territory. So, Eileen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Robert.
It's a
Good to
pleasure.
be here.
It's a pleasure talking to you once again. So, in our last interview, you touched upon the fact that one of the aspects of working with Marge is that you got some pretty good training in how to observe quality of movement, both in yourself and in others. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
I sure would. So we talked in the last interview of uh, Marge's, I can't remember what we called it, her legacy or her effect on the Alexander world in general. And we were talking about her really being one of the main, if not the starter of group teaching, the person that really enabled us to learn to teach in groups, following her example and her training in that.
Mm-hmm.
And but we didn't talk about her legacy to her students who worked with her quite a bit, and how that might be different in some ways than some other Alexander trainings.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the major uh, unusual things that we learned from Marge was how to see, how to observe movement and quality of use. So when I say how to observe movement, I don't mean that somebody's raising their left arm and we know that's their left arm.
We'd already mastered that pretty much.
But how to observe what quality of use that they have with their head in relation to their neck and back, or their head in relation to their whole body, their whole self.
Mm-hmm.
And we learned very subtle changes in that. And
Mm-hmm.
she did quite a bit of training us in that.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, part of that was an outgrowth of the fact that she worked primarily in groups. So you, as a member of the group, had a lot of opportunity to observe her and the person she happened to be directly addressing at any point.
Yes. And it wasn't just that she worked in groups, but she trained us to see in an Alexander fashion. And she did that by when she was working with somebody and they'd make a little change, she'd say, "Did you all see that? Now, what did you notice? What did all of you notice? What did each of you see?" And she'd ask us what we saw. She'd demonstrate it again.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to see when someone was just starting to lose their constructive thinking, or when someone wasn't doing their constructive thinking, or when someone was just starting to activate their constructive thinking. We got to see these moments almost pre-movement. They're not pre-movement because they do show up as movements, but they're these subtle little changes that go with someone's thinking. And she connected it with that person's thinking. So it wasn't just that she would put her hands on somebody and they make this beautiful change, and then we'd see, oh, they made this nice change. They got wider and longer or whatever. It was more, what did you see that person do at the start of their movement? It's more what you saw someone do with their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the amazing thing of her training us to see. And so we learn to see in a way where we're just not just visually noticing something, not just seeing something, but seeing it and sensing in ourselves, sensing that change at the same time that we're seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
So we learn to kind of do what I call a combination of see, feel. Feel isn't quite the right word, but see, sense, I guess, is a better word. So sometimes I use the word see, sense, because it's something you actually visually see, but you sense the difference in your own use also when watching that person. And she trained us in that repeatedly. Every time she worked with someone, she would say, she'd often ask the person, what do you notice? But she'd ask us, what do you all notice? What do you all see?
Right. And of course, those changes that could happen in you, the observer, has been explained by recent neuroscience research into mirror neurons.
Yes, what someone else is doing with their use certainly
Yeah.
affects our use.
Yeah.
And especially if we're doing our constructive thinking, we have a much clearer experience of it. We can sense a lot more detail, but it's so visual at the same time.
Yeah.
Just these very subtle changes. Marge would ask someone a question, and perhaps they just start tightening a little bit or pulling down in their answer, and she'd say, what did you see? Did you see that? Or you'd say stiffen or something. And we got to see such minute changes in people. That was those changes that were connected to their thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Marge, when she got to be into her early to mid 90s, she had a home health aides who would look after her at home. And I don't know whether you remember Cammie.
I do.
Yes, well, Cammie was one of her favorites, and Cammie was someone who really loved Marge, and she was there a lot of the time. She would often be there for 24-hour shifts, in fact. And I remember one time after she was working with a small group, I think, or it might have just been 2 or 3 people, because she wasn't really doing large groups at that point. I was talking to Cammie afterwards, who would always sit in, and she kept a very watchful eye on Marge for safety reasons, if nothing else. And she asked me if it made sense that she felt so much lighter and easier after one of those sessions. And I said, yes, I suppose so. I mean, it was a little bit of a surprising question because Marge didn't work with her. And as far as I know, Marge never actually worked with her. But Cammie was a smart lady and a keen observer. And that was the question she asked me. And I think that's pretty much exactly the same kind of thing you're talking about.
Yes, and another thing that Marge would do with people that helped us learn to observe more, if someone said they would like to, whatever, work with walking, pick up their instrument, or work with speaking, she'd have them just start doing that activity just for a moment. And say, well, what did you notice? What did you all notice? And then she'd help them with their thinking, and she'd help them a bit with her hands. She did less and less with her hands as time went on.
Right.
She did more just really waking up that person's thinking, getting their attention and getting them to wake up their conscious directions, their constructive thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and getting them to notice what what the quality was of that, whether they were stiffening when their attention went somewhere else, whether they were engaging in their thinking, and getting those who watched to notice that.
Right, right.
So we really had we had this, in a way, very similar lesson to the person that was being worked with.
Absolutely. And I found that when I was in her classes, when she was working primarily with other people, I was never bored because there was always some interesting development taking place that I could observe and think about. So that
Yeah.
part of the genius of her group work. So
And yes, and if you did get a little distracted, you'd hear her say to everyone, "Did you see that? What did anyone see?" And you think, "Uh-oh,
yeah,
no, I was thinking of this. I was off here. My mind was going over here."
thinking
um,
about
so,
lunch.
so she really brought you back with that,
yeah,
and really just kept you
yeah,
observing yourself and someone else at the same time.
yeah, yeah. So I now remember what the second thing we were going to talk about is, which is, and it's kind of an obvious question in a way, but I know you work with students using Skype or Zoom or other long distance methods, as do I. And how would you say that helps us teaching someone using Skype? And when I
Yes,
say Skype, I really mean Skype
online.
online.
Yes,
Yes. Hmm.
yes, yes. Uh, it it makes all the difference in the world,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah. Say a little
because
bit about that. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
because otherwise it's kind of like, how you might somebody might try and learn Alexander from a book. It's just someone saying words otherwise.
Right.
But if well, it's not really true. Somebody on the other end, an Alexander teacher, can demonstrate.
Hmm.
But if you can watch the fine little changes in someone's thinking, the very start of something changing in someone's thinking and how that affects their use,
Hmm.
just at the start of it, and say, what did you notice right there? What were you thinking right there?
Right.
And you can really help someone learn their constructive thinking, learn to give constructive directions that way, and catch what they're doing themselves, and catch it at the very start of them initiating it.
Exactly.
And it really, that has such a powerful effect. It really gives people their own, I don't know if agency is the right word, but it gives them the ability to, right from the start, to really take charge themselves, to watch, well, what am I thinking? What am I telling myself to do? What effect is that having on me? So instead of being lost in feeling and trying to get something right, catch them right at the beginning by seeing what they're doing when the moment they start to go off into stiffening or end gaining with their thinking. You can see it in the slightest change of muscle tone,
Hmm.
system. You can see it in the slightest change of direction. Even before they make a very noticeable movement, it's very visible. Change in their eye muscles, all kinds of subtle things that we were so used to seeing watching Marge teach. And so it helps so much to know then, oh, okay, so at that point the student lost their thinking just at that, and you can catch them at that point so they
Hmm.
don't get
Yeah.
too far past that, and they can recognize what they did differently in their directions and their methods.
Yeah. And one of the beautiful things about distance learning is that, of course, you can record the calls, and I record them all the time, and I always send it to the student. And for a lot of my students, they'll tell me that yeah, the lesson was great, but what really cemented it for them was watching it a second or maybe even a third time. And some of them will even say there was a little moment there that I went through several times. It took me a little while to get what you were to match up what I was seeing with what you were saying, but that's an advantage that Marge didn't have when she was working with live groups
That's
in
true. And
person.
I don't record them myself. Some of my students do on their own, and
Mm-hmm.
that's fine. That's great. But I don't myself. But still works out well to just catch those changes
Mm-hmm.
very quickly in their thinking at the moment their thinking changes, because then they recognize it. They know, oh, I know what I was thinking a moment ago. Just that second ago, I can see where my thinking changed.
Yep.
And wow,
Absolutely.
how do you like that? That had quite an effect on the use of my body.
Mm-hmm.
And they start recognizing that effect and also recognizing the effect of their constructive thinking immediately on their body, because you can guide them through that in a timing that even hands-on I don't think you can do. And the reason I say that, it's not really true you can do that hands-on, but a lot of the times hands-on, we're behind someone, we're to the side of someone. And when you're seeing someone right there facing you, you can see such little changes in their face muscles, their eye muscles, their head in relation to their body. You'll
Mm-hmm.
see the head in relation to their body and some other changes from the side or the back.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll even see that moment where their thinking changes just by seeing the slightest change in their eyes and their face muscles the moment that their thinking changes,
Yep.
either in a constructive way or in a way that's slightly more habitual.
Right. Yeah. Well.
And you really help them get over that hump in themselves. And they recognize it and they go, oh, yeah, of course, I was thinking that. And there's the results of thinking that. And when I think my direction's this way, and this is what happens. And they notice the moment they lose that.
Yeah.
The moment they go from thinking their constructive directions to holding the result. They can catch that moment immediately, because you can catch it watching them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
With
But
that
it
kind of
does it
training.
takes a little practice, but you can. And your students can learn to catch it by self-observation too. They have their own recording of the lesson. Well, this takes me into our third topic, closely related to the second. And I just want to warn our listeners here that we are now verging into controversial territory, but we're good with that, right?
Yeah. Yes,
So,
groups were controversial for
indeed.
quite a long time.
Yeah,
A number of years ago in the early 1980s,
yeah,
groups were very controversial, group teaching.
yep.
So,
So the current controversy is the big controversy right now is distance learning as lessons over the internet, so to speak. And there's some pretty strong views on both sides of that. Um, the question that I think we might want to explore is uh, if Marge, of course, died in 1995, but let's say that we could bring Marge back for a little while and show her the internet and what was possible. How do you think she would have responded to the prospect of using it to teach somebody?
well, obviously, this is just our speculation here, but I would imagine she would have loved it.
Yeah.
She was so big at reaching out to the whole world with this and helping as many people as possible. And like you said earlier, with mirror neurons, you can easily, when you demonstrate, when you're doing your own constructive thinking as a teacher, the student actually sees that and gets almost a hands-on experience out of that without realizing it. They
Mm-hmm.
imitate not the change in position, of course, not any change like that, but the actual change, almost an energetic change, that change in direction,
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
change towards more ease. They imitate that undoing. and in that lively way without trying to do it. They just automatically get that.
Mm-hmm.
And the clearer you can give that example, the better. And Marge would have just been amazing at that. She would have loved it. She would have so enjoyed reaching so many people and just being able to work with their thinking like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
She would
Yeah.
have devised all kinds of new ways of doing that, I think.
I think she would have. And I think her general personality was one of, if someone proposed some new thing to her, maybe teaching a workshop in a new place that she hadn't before, or I don't know, any sort of new idea, she would tend to go for it if she, as she would so nicely put it, well, I'll just take a gambling chance on that. She was very open to new things in
Yeah,
general. And one of the,
absolutely.
and just to go back a second to the group work thing, the first group Alexander lesson was taught in 1895 in Melbourne by Mr. FM himself, which he writes about. I think I can't remember where. I think it's in his first book, and he describes the situation as someone contacts him and asks him to teach a group of roughly 20 people at a theological college. And he says to the person, well, I've never done that before, but I'm willing to give it a try if you're willing to accept that I'm doing this for the first time, something like that. And then he says a little bit about what he did, and he concludes by saying, and I'm really glad I accepted that challenge. And it's the reason I bring that up is in the centerline edition of Use of the Self, with the introduction by Marge. She describes the invitation she got to teach a group class, I believe in Texas. And she had never taught a group class before, and she says almost the exact same thing. I've never done it before, but someone's asked me, so I thought I would just go down there and see what happens.
Yes,
It's
that's
exactly
exactly
her
what she would
attitude.
often say to anything that was a new suggestion is, well, let's give it a try and see what happens.
She was
Let's
very
just
open to
let's
new
let's
things.
let's just see what happens.
Hmm.
And so she would just take a chance on it and just to see what happens and observe the results.
Exactly. That was sort of built into her DNA, I think. So, is there anything else you want to say about observations, distance teaching, Marge, and distance teaching speculation?
Uh, I don't know there's anything more I want to say, but I do want to emphasize the uniqueness again of that training that we had with Marge, where we really learned to see what someone was doing with their use
Yeah,
by watching. But
right.
very subtle little changes, just the beginning of a change of direction, just the beginning of a tightening, or just the beginning of an undoing of an expansion of an inhibition. You saw it so instantly in an overall change in them. I mentioned you see it in their face and their eyes, but you see it in their whole system. And I'm often I see this all the time, but I'm often so surprised each all the time with this, although I know it happens and it's part of how I teach online. But even when I'm just seeing, someone in the frame where it's just their head and their shoulders in the frame,
Hmm.
I'll see when they change, maybe they think a certain way about their knees, and you see this change in them.
Hmm.
You see it, you can see, even if they don't say they did that with their knees, you can see, you just did that. It's so easy to see what someone is doing, even when it's not on screen, when you even see any part of them on screen.
Hmm.
And it's just fascinating. Sometimes someone will stand up and and they haven't adjusted their camera so they stand up and you see mainly their chest on the screen and
Right.
not their head or their legs.
Yeah.
And you can, and they'll make a change somewhere else in their body, other than the primary control. They'll think, oh, I something about my leg, or I was noticing my foot, and they won't say it, but you say, wow, I can really see that. And then you ask them about it, and then you say, well, yeah, I was kind of thinking of trying to do something with my foot, and I hadn't come back to my constructive thinking of the primary control. And then you can remind them, but you even catch those things. And Marge would have been so fascinated by all of that, I think.
Yeah.
Uh, and it really is moving into a way of helping people help themselves very quickly and very clearly.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, let's end on that. My guest today has been Eileen Troberman, an Alexander Technique teacher in Encinitas, California. That's near San Diego. I'll be putting information about her by the interview. I'll also put some information on a site about the Alexander Technique in general. Eileen, thank you so much for this.
You are so welcome, Robert. It's been my pleasure.